Back when I was in school, I distinctly remember how my classmates and I were horrified by the Nazi crimes. And I vividly recall our teachers insisting that, in the end, justice prevailed at the Nuremberg trials, that good ultimately triumphed over evil. The war has ended and Nazis were either killed or sentenced. It took me quite a while to realize that, while comforting, this narrative wasn't the whole story. There are many people who believe in some form or another in universal justice, that even if earthly authorities fail to punish a wrongdoer, fate or divine intervention will ensure they get what they deserve. Though I've never personally held such conviction, learning about the Ratlines not only shocked me, but also revealed the first crack in the tidy story of post-war justice. Despite the surprisingly brief summaries found on Wikipedia and websites that mirror its content, this chapter of history is one of the most complex and tangled. I've spent a significant amount of time researching and trying to understand just a small but well-studied portion of this dark period. And that's the story I want to share with you in this video. The desire to evade punishment is sadly a natural part of human behavior. No wonder then that approximately from 8 to 30,000 Nazis managed to slip through the cracks. But how did they pull it off? Well, after the war, Allied detention camps were overwhelmed. Resources and oversight were stretched so thin that keeping order was nearly impossible. Many Nazis blended into the ranks of displaced persons, those forcibly brought to Germany for slave labor, military prisoners, or even concentration camp survivors. In a nation still reeling from devastation, chaos reigned where order was desperately needed. Even now, it's hard to imagine the chaos and confusion of the occupation era in a country that had only recently shouted yes to total Krieg with such fervor. One of the key figures behind the escape of Nazi war criminals was Austrian Bishop Alois Hudal, then rector of the Pontificio Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome. Even before the war, his open support for Nazism was notorious. He boldly published The Foundations of National Socialism in 1936, praising Nazi ideals while dismissing their anti-Christian elements. After the war, he turned his influence to a far darker purpose, using his Vatican connections to orchestrate the escape of Nazis via the so-called Ratlines. Hudal seized on the post-war chaos. With refugees and criminals alike thrown together in disorder, he presented himself as a humanitarian. By exploiting ties with organizations like Caritas International and the Red Cross, he secured batches of blank identity forms. Originally intended for genuine refugees, they became the golden tickets for Nazi fugitives. Under his direction, these forms were filled out with names that were either entirely fabricated or taken from the dead, allowing notorious war criminals to vanish without a trace. Hudal's network soon expanded far beyond Italy. In Spain, Portugal, and Switzerland, fellow clerics and complicit officials provided shelter, food, and funds for fugitives and ensured that forged documents were validated and made it across borders. Processed through Vatican channels, shielded by the Holy See's unique diplomatic status, these papers were passed off as legitimate acts of charity. In some cases, Caritas even backed them with financial aid or travel tickets. Meanwhile, fugitives waited in safe houses scattered across Italy, from Rome to Genoa to Milan, often hidden in monasteries or other church-owned properties. Under the guise of religious sanctuary, Nazi criminals would hide for weeks or even months, guarded by members of Hudal's network as they patiently awaited their new identities. Once everything was in place, fugitives were directed to major ports like Genoa. There, Hudal's collaborators secured passage to South America via Spain and Portugal, with Argentina, Brazil and Chile emerging as favored destinations due to their lenient immigration policies and willingness to overlook the past. By exploiting humanitarian channels and church resources, Hudal engineered a seamless pipeline that allowed some of history's most infamous war criminals to slip away and start new lives abroad. Franz Stangl, a former commandant of Treblinka, a death factory designed for a horrifyingly efficient genocide. Under his watch, nearly 1 million people were killed. Victims were deceived into believing they were entering shower rooms, only to find themselves trapped in gas chambers. After the war, Stangl managed to escape from an Austrian prison in 1948, thanks to guard and local officials who conveniently decided to look the other way. Slipping south to Rome, he sought out Bishop Hudal, who provided him with a Red Cross passport, a visa to Syria and a ship ticket. Armed with fresh papers, Stangl faded into Damascus, working there in a textile mill for several years, until migrating to Brazil, where he worked at Volkswagen do Brasil plant in São Bernardo do Campo. He was found and captured only 2 decades later, in 1967, extradited to West Germany, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. Adolf Eichmann, one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, who oversaw the logistics of mass deportations to extermination camps, also benefited from Hudal's aid. They met in Rome, where, through Hudal's connections, Eichmann received a new identity as Ricardo Clement. With new documents, he traveled to Argentina, where he lived quietly until Israeli Mossad agents captured him in 1960. He was brought to Israel, tried for crimes against humanity, and executed in 1962. Walter Hauff, the SS officer responsible for the design and deployment of mobile gas chambers that killed tens of thousands, took a similar route. He was hiding in Milan while Hudal was preparing his papers. With new passport and generous financial assistance, he first went to Syria, where he worked for the intelligence service. After a year, he set sail for Ecuador, and finally in 1958, he was invited by Augusto Pinochet as an international expert to organize Chile's internal security apparatus. Despite attempts for extradition and later assassination, after all the brutal misery he caused, Rauff died in 1984, having never faced a real reckoning for his crimes. Eduard Roschmann, an SS officer and commandant of the Riga ghetto, was notorious for his brutal treatment of Jewish prisoners. Known as the Butcher of Riga, he orchestrated mass executions and inhumane conditions for thousands. Like many others, with Hudal's help, this butcher fled to South America. For years, Roschmann lived under a fake name, escaping any serious manhunt. He died in Paraguay in 1977. His victims never granted the satisfaction of seeing him stand trial. Erich Priebke, an SS officer who participated in the massacre at the Ardentine caves in Rome, where 335 civilians were slaughtered as punishment for partisan attacks. When the war ended, he slipped out of the British POV camp in 1946, headed to Rome, and got the full Hudal travel package. In Argentina, he settled in San Carlos de Bariloche, where he lived openly under his real name and became a respected member of the local German community. It wasn't until 1994, when investigative reporters blew his cover, that he finally faced extradition to Italy. Convicted of crimes against humanity, he received a life sentence which he served under house arrest. Josef Mengele earned the grotesque nickname Angel of Death at Auschwitz, where he conducted unspeakably cruel medical experiments on prisoners, often children. He played mad scientist with sterilization via X-rays, injected chemicals into victims' bodies, and performed surgery without anesthesia, treating humans like lab rats for his twisted curiosity. Despite international manhunts, Mengele managed to vanish into South America. Hudal allegedly played a key role in facilitating his escape, ensuring this nightmare in a lab coat avoided justice until he died in Brazil in 1979. Gerhard Bonne was a bureaucrat of death, a principal organizer of the Aktion T4 euthanasia program, a merciless operation that targeted the disabled, mentally ill, and anyone the Nazi regime deemed unworthy of life. Bonne oversaw gas chambers, lethal injections, and widespread starvation, personally signing off on the murders of tens of thousands. After the war, Bonne initially blended into the chaos of the post-war Europe, but by 1949 he had turned to Hudal's pipeline for falsified papers. He sailed off to South America, Argentina specifically, where he lived under an assumed identity and integrated into local society, managing to evade justice for years. When he was eventually tracked down and extradited in the 1960s, legal loopholes in his deteriorating health shielded him from any real punishment, letting him slip away from the full force of justice. By 1947, the press had begun to reveal the Vatican's shadowy role in helping these Nazi fugitives, with Bishop Alois Hudal, the so-called fascist bishop, center stage. Public outcry erupted, but the Vatican largely kept quiet, offering no swift response or attempt to distance itself from his actions. It wasn't until 4 years later that Hudal was finally removed from his post at the Pontificio Santa Maria dell'Anima. Even so, he remained in Rome, stubborn and apologetic, claiming his deeds were simply acts of Christian charity. An audacious stance for a man whose charity had helped some of history's most monstrous war criminals escape justice. But Ratlines were just a small part of a much broader picture. Operations like Paperclip and Gladio were the bright example of Allies' brilliance. They didn't just let Nazis slip through the cracks, they rolled out the welcome mat. These operations didn't merely shield former Nazis from persecution, they repurposed them, giving them a fresh start and in some cases a hero's welcome. Operation Paperclip, the American program to recruit German scientists as soldiers for the looming Cold War with the Soviets, helped many criminals to evade justice. One of the most notorious beneficiaries was Werner von Braun, mastermind who developed the V2 rocket. Built by the forced labor of thousands of concentration camp prisoners at Mittelbau-Dora, many of whom died under appalling conditions, these missiles terrorized wartime Europe. Yet after 1945, von Braun was swiftly relocated to the US and hailed as a genius for his work on NASA's Saturn V project, which eventually put man on the moon. By the time he died in 1977, he was seen as a pioneering rocket scientist, while his wartime atrocities went largely ignored. Another figure was Otto Ambros, a chemist and executive at IG Farben, directly involved in production of Zyklon B, the gas used in extermination camps. Ambros also oversaw the construction of the Bunawerke factory at Auschwitz, where tens of thousands of prisoners labored under horrifying conditions. Yet after the war, Ambros' expertise in chemical engineering made him invaluable. Convicted at Nuremberg for his role in slave labor, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison, though he served only 3. Upon release, Ambros became a consultant for American chemical companies, including Dow and VR Grace, profiting handsomely despite his monstrous past. And then there is Hubertus Strachhold, often celebrated as the father of space medicine. During World War II, Strachhold played a key role in Nazi aviation research, contributing to experiments on prisoners at Dachau that pushed the boundaries of human endurance, at horrifying costs. These experiments involved subjecting prisoners to freezing temperatures, hypoxic chambers simulating high altitudes, and other grueling tests that frequently ended in death. After the war, Strachhold's scientific expertise proved too valuable for the US to ignore. He was brought over under Operation Paperclip, his past atrocities quietly overlooked, and he became instrumental in developing life support systems for NASA's space missions. Despite his dark legacy, his contributions earned him accolades, and even saw a medical library named in his honor. But while Paperclip operated somewhat openly, at least under the banner of scientific progress, Operation Gladio worked in the shadows. A NATO-backed plan to form underground resistance networks in case of a Soviet invasion, Gladio enlisted not just anti-communists but also ex-Nazis and fascist sympathizers. These clandestine cells became tangled in political intrigue, false flag attacks and espionage plots that further blurred the moral lines of post-war Europe. Figures like Klaus Barbie, the infamous Butcher of Lyon, found new life within these networks. Barbie had tortured and deported French resistance members and Jewish families during the war. Afterward, he worked for American and West German intelligence, shielded because of his supposed value in the fight against communism. His crimes were ignored for decades, and he only faced justice long after Gladio's usefulness had waned. It's perhaps most unsettling that, while these figures were denounced for their atrocities, they were also quietly rebranded and employed under new banners, some even becoming heroes of science or intelligence. Their war crimes weren't merely overlooked, they were repurposed for strategic gain. But this was only part of the broader picture, because even as thousands fled and others were recruited, a whole class of powerful collaborators, those who had profited handsomely under the Third Reich, stayed behind in German industry, never facing the reckoning they deserved. There is something haunting about the story of German industrial families during and after World War II. It's not just they exploited slave labor, directly benefiting from the suffering and death of millions. It's that after the war they managed to walk away, wealthy, influential, and largely unpunished. And perhaps the most troubling part is how this wasn't some shadowy secret, but a reality allowed to unfold in broad daylight. Take the Krupp dynasty, for instance. Their factories churn out the tanks and artillery that fueled Hitler's war machine. They used over 100,000 forced laborers, many of whom were concentration camp prisoners. The conditions were unspeakable: starvation, beatings, and outright neglect. After the war, Alfred Krupp, the head of the company, was sentenced to 12 years in prison at Nuremberg. But just 3 years later, he was released and back in business. By the 1960s, the Krupp empire was flourishing again, its reputation conveniently scrubbed clean, and his company resumed operations, eventually becoming a major part of modern ThyssenKrupp. Then there is the Quandt family, a powerful industrial dynasty that thrived under Nazi rule. Under Günther's Quandt leadership, the enterprises, including AFA, operated with thousands of cursed workers, many from concentration camps. These individuals lived and toiled under brutal conditions, fueling the Quandt's business success. But despite their deep entanglement with the regime, Günther Quandt escaped significant punishment after the war, classified merely as a follower rather than a major war criminal. This allowed the family to retain their wealth and continue expanding their influence in post-war Germany. After the war, the Quandt family maintained and expanded their industrial empire, eventually acquiring a significant stake at BMW. And then we have the Reimann family, whose name might not ring a bell, though their brands certainly do. If you had a Krispy Kreme donut, a Pret-a-Manger sandwich, or a Dr. Pepper soda, you've contributed to their empire. Albert Reimann Sr. and his son Albert Reimann Jr. were enthusiastic Hitler supporters and ardent anti-Semites. Their industrial chemical company, Benckiser, used forced labor extensively, not only within their factories, but also in their private residence. Historical records show that female workers from Eastern Europe were forced to stand at attention naked in factory barracks. Those who refused were sexually abused, beaten, or kicked by their overseers. The Reimanns personally condoned and benefited from those atrocities, integrating Nazi ideology into their business operations. Yet after the war, they faced no significant consequences. For decades, their descendants remained unaware of their Nazi past, until 2019, when the family commissioned an internal investigation into their history. The findings confirmed their deep involvement with the Nazi regime, and in response, the family pledged 10 million euros to charity, a gesture many critics viewed as a mere token of accountability. These aren't just stories of greed, they're stories of a society willing to look the other way. It wasn't just that these families and corporations avoided justice, it's that the post-war world prioritized rebuilding economies over punishing the guilty. So, what do we have in the end? The Ratlines, Operations Paperclip and Gladio, unpunished industrial giants, they paint a stark portrait of humanity's capacity for moral compromise. It's easy to feel despair to see these stories as proof that justice bends to power, but buried beneath this ugliness is another truth. Even in our darkest hours, individuals can become catalysts for change. For every Hudal shielding war criminals, there was a Simon Wiesenthal, a Holocaust survivor who dedicated his life to tracking down Nazis like Eichmann. For every complicit official, there were journalists like Beate Klarsfeld, who hunted Klaus Barbie across continents, or prosecutors like Fritz Bauer, who've defied his government to bring Auschwitz guards to trial. These were ordinary people who refused to look away. They dug through archives, followed leads, and risked their safety not for glory, but because silence was unthinkable. Which brings me to why I made this video. Because the greatest red line isn't mapped in secret networks. It's the red line coiled in the shadows of your own thinking.